One evening, Nanar-Shumu returned home, his body aching with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He stripped off his simple woolen tunic, its fibers stiff with sweat and dust, and knelt to clean his hands. His wife, Amat Mamu, a woman whose strength matched his own but was channeled into the domestic and administrative sphere, placed a ration of beer and a flatbread on their small clay table. "The new banda Ninsun," Amat Mamu said, her voice low and tight. "He took the two best sheaves from our neighbor, Enlil Tugal. Said the grain was spoiled." "Spoiled? It was the best barley in the village," Nanar-Shumu grunted, taking a long drink of the thick, weak beer. He knew Enlil Tugal was rationing the water. "They call it inspection. It is just theft for the granaries of Ur." This exchange perfectly illustrates the heart of the ancient farmer's struggle, the conflict between environmental reality and bureaucratic expectation. The drought was an act of the gods, a collective failure of piety, but the taxation was an act of the state, a precise, calculated burden designed to extract every last grain of surplus. The tyranny of the tablet, the tax system. The Ur-III Empire was not unique in having taxes, but it was unique in its meticulous record-keeping. The system that defined Nanar-Shumu's existence was the Bala system. The Bala, literally meaning to turn or to revolve, was a massive system of goods redistribution and mandatory tribute. Essentially, it was a gigantic interprovincial tax where each city-state was required to contribute a certain amount of grain, silver, livestock, or labor to the central government. But for the individual farmer, the extraction was far more direct and pervasive. The negah, the state's share. The land Nanar-Shumu worked was not his, it belonged to the temple or the crown. He was obligated to surrender a fixed percentage of his harvest, often 50% or more, directly to the state granary. This was his rent. The geu, corvée or labor tax. He owed a certain number of days of compulsory labor. This could mean digging or clearing canals, building ziggurats, military conscription, or simply serving as a porter. This was not paid in grain, but in his most precious commodity, time. This labor tax was often levied at the most critical periods of the farming cycle. The mash, interest or debt. Drought years were debt years. If Nanar-Shumu needed seed grain or a replacement ox, he would borrow it from the temple storehouse. The interest rates were astronomical. Often a mash, interest, of 20% for silver and 33.3% for grain. A single bad year could plunge a family into generations of inescapable servitude, the threat of becoming wardum, slaves. Nanar-Shumu knew that even if he beat the drought, he might not beat the scribe. He walked out to the edge of his field in the deepening twilight. The mud was cracked, the color of old bone. He bent down and picked up a piece of the broken earth, crumbling it between his fingers. "The yield will be low, Amat Mamu," he whispered to the dry wind. "The negah will leave us with nothing. They will not care that the rain failed. They will only see the empty space in the granary ledger." The inevitable crisis. War arrives on a dust cloud. The pressure of the low harvest and the high taxes created an immediate internal crisis, but history rarely allows for a single crisis at a time. The stability of the Ur-III Empire was fundamentally dependent on its ability to feed itself and its massive standing army. When the fields failed, the empire's borders became thin and porous. The enemies of the empire were not abstract barbarians. They were organized tribal groups driven by the very same environmental pressures as the Sumerians, the Martu, later called Amorites. These semi-nomadic peoples, who lived on the margins of the western desert, saw the centralized state and its granaries as their only chance for survival.
The drought that withered Nanar-Shumu's barley also withered the meager grazing land of the Martu herds. Driven by hunger, the Martu began to press eastward. One midsummer morning, when the sun was a punishing coppery disk and the barley stalks were tragically short and pale, Nanar-Shumu was out with his sons, desperately trying to divert the last precious trickle of water to the farthest rows. A loud, urgent blast from the city wall horn of Ur pierced the heavy air. It was the signal for levy, the call for all able-bodied men to report to the district armory, the Eduba. The enemy had penetrated the western line of defense, a vast, snaking structure known as the Murik Tidnim, or the Amorite Wall, a last-ditch attempt by King Shu-Sin to keep the desert people out. Nanar-Shumu felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was the ultimate state extraction, the tax of blood and body. He looked at his two sons, Ur-Enlil, 18, and Lugal-Me, 16. If he went, the fields would surely fail, and the family would starve or be sold into debt slavery. If he didn't go, he would be a deserter, and the punishment for treason against the divine king of Ul was execution. This is the ultimate, terrible choice that countless ancient farmers faced: sacrifice the family to save the state, or save the family and doom yourself. He walked slowly back to the house. Amat Mamu met him at the door, her face a mask of terrible, resigned comprehension. "The levy?" she asked, her voice flat. "The Martu," Nanar-Shumu confirmed. "I have to go." He did not grab a bronze axe or a spear. He grabbed his old, cracked leather shield and the small, rusted bronze sickle he used for reaping. When the farmer went to war, he took the tools of his trade. He was not a professional soldier. He was a desperate conscript, now fighting not for the king's glory, but for the hope of a field still standing when he returned. He looked at the dusty, half-grown barley in his field, the single crop that held the lives of his wife and sons. He looked at the cracked mud, a monument to the drought. He looked toward the great, distant city of Ur, the source of his taxes and the master of his fate. And Nanar-Shumu, the farmer, walked toward the hornblast, disappearing into the dust kicked up by the other conscripts, an anonymous drop in the deluge of history. This is how it began. The farmer was the foundation, and therefore the first to be crushed by the edifice of civilization. This is the opening section, roughly 1,800 words, focusing on setting the scene, characters, and the complex issues of drought, taxation, Bala system, and the onset of war, Martu or Amorites. Would you like me to continue the story of Nanar-Shumu and his family as they navigate the wartime economy, the debt crisis, and the eventual collapse of the Ur III Empire, providing more historical and sociological detail?
The Silent Crucible: Seeds of Resilience in the Fertile Crescent. The human story is not built on monuments, but on mud. It is not sung by kings, but hummed by the weary farmer bent double in the relentless glare of the sun. If you wish to understand the true nature of civilization, its breathtaking rise, and its grinding cost, you must look past the towering ziggurats and gilded thrones, and instead focus your gaze on the flat clay plains where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carve their erratic, life-giving paths. This is the Fertile Crescent, ancient Sumer, a land that learned to live and die by the calendar of water. Tonight, we step back 4 millennia, into the early Bronze Age, to a time when cities like Ur and Uruk were not ruins, but pulsing, magnificent hubs of innovation, all built upon the tireless, often brutal labor of the field. This is the unvarnished reality of ancient farmers, their endurance through droughts, wars, and taxes. The first scrape of the plow, a Sumerian dawn. Our story begins in the year 2115 BCE, in the shadow of the recently restored Third Dynasty of Ur, a period known as the Ur III Empire. This was a time of immense bureaucratic complexity, stability, and, consequently, crushing state demands. Imagine a place where the air hangs thick and heavy, smelling of baked clay, dusty bitumen, and the sweet decaying scent of irrigation water. Our gaze settles on a small walled village called Kagina, situated on a lesser canal feeding off the main artery of the Euphrates, some distance south of the capital, Ur. Here we meet Nanar-Shumu, a man in his late 30s, his body a testament to 2 decades of heavy toil. His shoulders are wide, permanently slumped forward from carrying water jars and sacks of barley. His hands are thick and calloused, ingrained with the dark soil of his plot. Nanar-Shumu is not a tenant farmer. He is one of the Shu Blugala, a man of the king's plow. In theory, he is a free citizen working state land. In practice, he is a cog in the massive engine of the Ur III state economy, managed by temple priests and royal overseers. His land, a narrow rectangular strip, runs perpendicular to the canal, a standard practice designed to ensure equitable access to the lifeblood of Sumer, the water. Note on scale and complexity. The Ur III state was an administrative marvel. Its bureaucratic records, impressed onto thousands of clay tablets, detail everything from the daily ration of beer to a common laborer to the inventory of livestock seized in a distant province. This was not a simple kingship. It was a centrally planned command economy, the world's first great experiment in state control. The system that governed Nanar-Shumu's life was an absolute reliance on irrigation technology. Sumerian life was predicated on the control of the rivers. The natural flood cycle of the Tigris and Euphrates, unlike the predictable Nile, was erratic and often violent, sometimes flooding after the harvest was gathered. Farmers like Nanar-Shumu didn't rely on a simple rain-fed agriculture. They were master hydraulic engineers, utilizing the yoked ox plow, or appen, the seed drill, and an intricate lattice of patum, large canals, shegum, secondary ditches, and haru, small field channels. The spring of 2115 BCE began ominously. The specter of drought, when the rivers fail. In the late winter, before the vital barley sowing could begin in earnest, the reports from the northern provinces, carried downriver by the fast cargo boats, were grim. The headwaters of the Euphrates had experienced a failure of the winter snowmelt, an early indicator of a regional, multi-year dry spell. For Nanar-Shumu and his neighbors, this news was a cold terror. In a normal year, the Euphrates would rise, flooding the main canals and allowing them to be open to gravity-feed the lower-lying fields. This year, the water level remained stubbornly low. The river, the god of life, was barely a lazy brownish trickle in the main sluices. The effects were immediately catastrophic. Increased salinization. The water level dropped meant that fresh water was not flooding the fields to push down the salt naturally wicked up by evaporation. Sumerian fields were already prone to salinization due to poor drainage over centuries. The main crop, barley or shea, which is more salt-tolerant than wheat, zid, was all they could risk planting. Nanar-Shumu knew this. He watched the white crystalline crust already forming on the edges of his fallow plot. Labor doubled. If the water wouldn't come to the field, the farmer had to bring the water to the field. This meant hours spent with a shaduf, a simple counterweighted lever device, or a sweep-and-bag mechanism, lifting water from the lower-level canal and pouring it laboriously into the field channels.
This back-breaking work was normally only necessary in high summer, but now it began in the spring planting season. The Sipa and the new Banda. The state bureaucracy, far from helping, only intensified the pressure. The Sipa, shepherds or overseers, and the new Banda, foremen, charged with maximizing the harvest for the Gal, the royal palace, and the Dingir, the temple, began to make daily inspections. They didn't care about the low water, they cared only for the quota, the expected yield.